What if I told you that a woman changed the destiny of an entire nation, defying all expectations and breaking down barriers imposed by her time? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Yet, this is exactly what the Bible presents to us in the story of Deborah. In an era where leadership was exclusively a man's domain, she emerged as an unstoppable force, a prophetess, a judge, and, above all, a leader who inspired warriors and turned fear into faith. You might be wondering, what made Deborah so special? It wasn't military power, wealth, or political status. It was her unshakable connection with God and her willingness to act, even when others hesitated. She didn't just face an army equipped with iron chariots, the equivalent of today's tanks, but led with a rare combination of divine strategy and human courage. Now think about it. How often do you feel small in the face of life's challenges? Deborah shows us that with faith and determination, any battle can be won. Here's the most intriguing part. This isn't just a story of victory. It's a story that breaks paradigms and redefines what leadership means. Deborah wasn't alone in her journey. She inspired Barak, challenged the status quo, and made room for an ordinary woman, Jael, to become an unexpected heroine. There's no denying it. This is a story that grips you from start to finish. And what can you learn from it? Perhaps more than you imagine. Because deep down, we all face our own Siseras, those obstacles that seem insurmountable. Deborah's story is a powerful reminder that true strength doesn't come from our circumstances, but from our faith. Are you ready to uncover the secrets of this unstoppable woman and how her story can transform the way you face challenges? The people of Israel lived under a heavy shadow, a time when the heavens seemed like bronze, and the earth like iron. Ruled by King Jabin of Canaan and his ruthless commander Sisera, they faced military and economic oppression. Imagine an army equipped with 900 iron chariots, symbolizing the overwhelming power of their enemies and the helplessness of God's people. For many, it seemed like a hopeless situation. But just as the tide of the sea changes, Israel's story was about to turn. How often do we feel like Israel, oppressed by situations that seem insurmountable? This is where we learn the lesson that even the deepest valley can become the setting for a divine revolution. In this context, suffering shaped their faith. Israel cried out to the Lord, and this desperate prayer was the spark for a change that no one could have foreseen. How many of us only seek divine answers when we've hit rock bottom? In those days, the people's cry was like the muffled shout of a captive longing for freedom. It's interesting to note how the greatest stories of triumph in the Bible, like Joseph in Egypt or Moses in the wilderness, began in moments of complete vulnerability. Perhaps it's because it is in the place of greatest weakness that God's power shines the brightest. The oppression was not only military but also psychological. The people had lost confidence in their ability to fight, reminding us that the hardest battles are often fought in the mind first. Sisera seemed invincible, and fear became a second enemy, eating away at hope like an invisible plague. Who hasn't felt like that? Sometimes, we face a modern-day Sisera. Debts, broken relationships, or even our own self-esteem. It's in these moments we must ask, what if God is about to intervene? But Israel's story shows that even oppression has a purpose. It's not easy to believe that when you're in the middle of the storm, but every blow the Israelites endured was preparing the stage for a miracle. It's like a farmer plowing hard soil before sowing. The pain of the plow is the prelude to the harvest. Are we missing signs today that something greater is about to happen in our lives? What's fascinating is that even amid oppression, God was raising an unexpected answer. Deborah, a woman, emerged as the unlikely leader of a people accustomed to male leaders. This not only broke the cultural paradigms of the time, but also taught us that God doesn't choose the equipped. He equips the chosen. Have you noticed that solutions to problems often appear in the most improbable places? Perhaps the answer you're seeking is where you least expect it. Israel's oppression was also a constant reminder that trusting in men or systems would not bring lasting deliverance. The people had strayed, relying on political alliances and weaponry, but now they needed to learn that true strength comes from the Lord. It reminds me of how we often place our trust in fleeting things, money, status, or connections, forgetting that the source of all power lies beyond us. And you? Where have you been placing your trust lately? And so, in the silence before the storm, Deborah begins to emerge as the answer to Israel's prayers. Her story, which we'll explore next, proves that even the darkest times can set the stage for acts of courage and faith. After all, when God decides to act, even an unlikely leader can change the destiny of an entire nation. But how did Deborah step into such a unique role? Imagine a woman seated under a palm tree, resolving disputes, advising her people, and hearing directly from God. This was Deborah, a judge and prophetess in a time when leaders were predominantly men. Her role was a paradox in a world dominated by patriarchal structures. But this is where the story becomes fascinating. Deborah didn't just challenge the norms, she redefined them. How often do we find ourselves in roles society tells us are not ours? Deborah teaches us that when God calls, He equips, and that changes everything. Deborah wasn't just a leader, she was a bridge between the people and God. Her wisdom came from a source far beyond human strategies or political skills. She had something few leaders possess: a direct connection with the Creator. This brings us to a powerful reflection. Are we seeking wisdom from the right sources? In today's world, filled with conflicting opinions and advice, Deborah's example reminds us of the importance of listening to God's voice above all others. Being a judge was an uncommon role for a woman at that time, but being a prophetess elevated her authority to another level. Deborah didn't just interpret Israel's laws, she also received divine instructions to guide her people. Imagine bearing the weight of decisions that would affect an entire nation. And yet, Deborah didn't hesitate. What can we learn from this? Perhaps that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to trust God's calling, even when it seems impossible. What's remarkable is that Deborah didn't use her position for personal gain. On the contrary, she understood that her authority came from God and used it for the collective good. How many leaders today share this perspective? Whether at work, in the family, or within the community, Deborah's example challenges us to lead with humility and purpose. Have you ever stopped to consider how you can exercise leadership in your daily life? It might be as simple as guiding a friend or as significant as leading a project. Deborah's calling also serves as a reminder that God chooses leaders according to His plan, not human standards. While many saw Deborah as just a woman, God saw a leader. This is a profound lesson about how we view our own potential and that of others. Are we limiting our possibilities because of labels and external expectations? If Deborah had allowed herself to be defined by what others thought, Israel would never have experienced deliverance. The most inspiring part is that Deborah didn't seek her position. She was chosen. This teaches us that a true calling isn't something we chase. It's something that finds us when we are ready. In her case, her willingness to listen and obey God made her fit to lead. Perhaps it's time to ask ourselves, are we ready to say yes to God's calling, even if it takes us to unknown places? And so, Deborah, this extraordinary woman, began to transform not just the life of Israel but also the history of faith and leadership. But a challenge lay ahead, a hesitant warrior who needed inspiration. How did Deborah handle this situation? Barak, the warrior called to lead Israel's army, was hesitant. And who could blame him? Sisera was a feared commander with a powerful army and iron chariots that seemed invincible. Yet, God had already declared victory through Deborah. But here's the question. Why did Barak hesitate? Perhaps he doubted himself, or maybe he feared the consequences of failure. How often do we feel the same, paralyzed in the face of challenges that seem bigger than we are? This is where faith comes into play. Not just faith in God, but faith that inspires others. Deborah, with her unshakable courage, wasted no time motivating Barak. She knew that his fear could jeopardize the mission, so she acted with firmness and conviction. Her famous response, "Certainly, I will go with you," was more than an act of support. It was a challenge. She was saying, if you don't trust yourself, trust me, because I trust God. What a powerful lesson. Sometimes, all we need is someone who believes in us enough to push us forward. Have you ever been that person for someone? Or has someone been that for you? But Barak set a condition. He would only go into battle if Deborah went with him. At first glance, this might seem like weakness, but it reveals something deeper about leadership. Barak recognized that Deborah's presence symbolized God's presence. He wanted more than a military strategy. He wanted the assurance that God was in control. Isn't that what we all seek in moments of uncertainty? A sign that we are not alone, that God is with us in our battles? The dynamic between Deborah and Barak shows us that leadership isn't just about command. It's about collaboration. Deborah brought vision and faith, while Barak brought strength and action. Together, they formed a team that changed Israel's destiny. This makes us reflect. Are we building partnerships with the right people? Do we recognize the unique gifts God has placed in each of us to fulfill His purposes? And then comes the humorous twist in the story. Deborah warned Barak that the final victory wouldn't be his but would come through a woman. Imagine his surprise hearing that. Yet this prophecy didn't diminish Barak's role. He was the leader on the battlefield, but his willingness to share the credit shows he learned a valuable lesson. It's not about who gets the glory, but about fulfilling God's purpose. Are we ready to set aside our egos for the sake of something greater? Deborah also teaches us that true leadership is about empowering others. She didn't overpower Barak. Instead, she inspired confidence in him. This is something we can apply in our own lives, whether in the family, workplace, or church. Think about the last time you helped someone believe in themselves. Was it easy or challenging? Perhaps it's time to practice more of that. With Barak finally convinced and Deborah by his side, the two were ready to face the challenge of their lives. But how did they turn this plan into action and confront an army that seemed unbeatable? That's what we'll explore next. When it came to strategy, Deborah proved to be as bold as she was wise. Inspired by divine instructions, she crafted a plan that defied human logic. Imagine facing an army equipped with iron chariots using only poorly armed warriors. But Deborah knew something Sisera didn't. The true power lay in God's favor, not in weapons. Following her guidance, Barak assembled his troops on Mount Tabor, a strategic location offering a terrain advantage. Once again, we see how faith and strategy can work together to produce extraordinary results. Deborah didn't just give instructions. She ensured Barak understood the source of their victory. "The Lord will deliver Sisera into your hands," she declared confidently. This statement was a reminder that the battle was already won before it even began. It's fascinating how the assurance of victory can transform our approach to challenges. How often do we face obstacles as if we've already lost, when the key to victory lies in our trust in God? The choice of Mount Tabor was also brilliant from a military perspective. By luring Sisera and his iron chariots into a confined area, Deborah and Barak set the stage for divine intervention. When God moves, even nature aligns with His plan. The torrential rain that turned the ground into mud was a dramatic reminder that even the greatest army is powerless before the Creator. This teaches us an important lesson. What often seems like a hindrance can actually be the key to our victory. Another remarkable aspect of Deborah's strategy was her ability to mobilize the people. She knew that victory required more than weapons. It required unity. Rallying the tribes of Israel during a time of division was an achievement in itself. This prompts us to reflect. Are we using our gifts and resources to unite those around us toward a common goal? If Deborah could inspire an entire nation, what can we accomplish in our families, churches, and communities? And, of course, there was an element of risk. Deborah put everything on the line. If the plan failed, the consequences would have been devastating. Yet she trusted God and her strategy. Sometimes, leadership means being willing to take risks. It's no wonder Deborah stands out as one of the most inspiring figures among Israel's judges. Her courage challenges us to ask, are we willing to take risks when we know God is calling us to act? Perhaps the most fascinating detail is how Deborah stayed by Barak's side, even knowing the victory would ultimately be credited to someone else. This reveals her humility and commitment to the greater purpose. For Deborah, it wasn't about receiving recognition. It was about ensuring Israel's deliverance. How many of us can say the same? Are we ready to lead without seeking credit? And so, with the troops positioned and the plan in motion, Deborah and Barak were prepared to face Sisera. But what no one expected was that the final blow would come from such an unlikely source. Who would be the heroine to change the course of history? The scene seemed unlikely. Jael, an apparently ordinary woman, suddenly became the centerpiece of an epic story. While Deborah and Barak led Israel to victory on the battlefield, Jael was in her tent, in a place where no one expected anything extraordinary to happen. Then came Sisera, the feared commander, fleeing from defeat. He sought refuge but met his destiny at the hands of someone who seemed to pose no threat. The irony is undeniable. God chose the unexpected to accomplish the inevitable. Jael was neither a warrior nor a prophetess. She was a woman of limited resources, living in the shadow of a conflict that didn't seem directly hers. Yet her courage and sense of timing placed her at the heart of Israel's narrative. How often do we underestimate our own abilities because we feel unprepared? Jael's story teaches us that when the right moment comes, God can use even our everyday skills and transform them into instruments of victory. Jael's act was both strategic and courageous. She offered Sisera hospitality, an act that seemed innocent and welcoming. Yet, behind the veil of kindness, there was unwavering determination. When Sisera let his guard down, Jael acted with precision and speed, using a tent peg to defeat him. It might seem like a brutal scene, but it's a reminder that, in times of oppression, courage sometimes takes bold forms. What does this teach us? That there are moments when we must act decisively, even if it takes us out of our comfort zone. Jael's bravery also raises the question: how do we face the Siseras in our own lives? They may not be fleeing commanders, but they might take the form of fears, insecurities, or challenges that try to bring us down. Jael didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. She took responsibility. What does that mean for us? Perhaps it's time to stop waiting for external solutions and start using the resources we already have. The impact of Jael's act was felt far beyond her tent. By defeating Sisera, she not only freed Israel from a dangerous enemy, but also altered the course of her nation's history. What's most fascinating is that her story resonates even today as an example of how God uses the unexpected to achieve the extraordinary. Are we willing to let God use us in ways that challenge our own expectations? Jael also shows us that we don't need to be public figures or formal leaders to make a difference. She acted behind the scenes, in a private space, yet her impact was felt across the nation. This challenges us to reconsider what it means to make history. Often, the greatest acts of courage happen in quiet places, away from an audience. Have you ever stopped to think how your actions, no matter how small they seem, could have a significant impact? And so, the victory was complete, and Israel could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the story doesn't end there. Deborah had something more to offer. A celebration that was not just a song of triumph, but also a tribute to God's faithfulness and the courage of His servants. What might this song reveal about Deborah's heart? Deborah's song was not just a celebration. It was a masterpiece that immortalized Israel's victory over Sisera. Imagine a hymn that echoes gratitude and awe for all that God had done while honoring the heroes who played their part in the journey. Yet, the song wasn't merely about military triumph. It was a proclamation of faith, a powerful reminder that God never abandons His people, even in their darkest moments. Deborah used her voice to inspire and teach, a rare combination that still resonates in biblical history. The song begins by exalting Israel's leadership and the willingness of its people to step forward for battle. When the leaders lead and the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. This phrase carries a profound lesson about the importance of unity between leaders and followers. How often do we see disheartened leaders and disengaged teams? Deborah's song reminds us that true strength lies in working together toward a greater purpose. In your daily life, how can you be part of a team that accomplishes great things? Deborah also used the song to highlight the tribes that joined the battle while calling out those who stayed on the sidelines. This might seem like a historical detail, but it's a lesson that transcends time. There are always those who act and those who remain passive. If we're honest, we've all been on both sides of this equation. The song challenges us to reflect. Are we active participants in God's plans, or are we just spectators? Another fascinating point is how Deborah narrates God's intervention in the battle. The Lord acted through nature, sending torrential rain that turned the ground into mud, neutralizing Sisera's iron chariots. The song's poetic imagery underscores a vital truth. When God acts, even the forces of creation align with His purposes. This teaches us to trust that, even when situations seem out of control, God is orchestrating something greater. Have you ever experienced moments when everything seemed lost, but then circumstances changed in an inexplicable way? The song also shines a spotlight on Jael, the unexpected heroine who defeated Sisera. Deborah calls her most blessed of women. This honor reinforces the message that God uses the unlikely to achieve the extraordinary. By praising Jael, Deborah also teaches that every role, no matter how small it seems, is essential in God's plan. Are we recognizing the contributions of those around us? Or are we underestimating the power of the small in our lives? Perhaps the most moving part of the song is its conclusion, contrasting Israel's victory with the defeat of their enemies. The song describes Sisera's mother anxiously waiting for his return, a poignant image of loss and the cost of opposing God's plan. It's a sobering yet necessary reminder that faithfulness to God is always rewarded, while defiance leads to ruin. What kind of legacy do we want to leave in our own journey? Deborah ends the song by exalting God's greatness and the peace that reigned in Israel for 40 years after the victory. But as we know, peace never lasts forever. And this brings the next challenge. How can we apply Deborah's lessons of courage, faith, and leadership in our own lives? The lessons from Deborah's story transcend time, revealing universal truths about courage, faith, and leadership. Imagine facing seemingly insurmountable challenges, as Deborah did. How often do we encounter situations that test not only our abilities but also our character? Deborah shows us that true leadership is not about position or power, but about obedience to God's call and a willingness to serve. This leads us to an essential question. How are we leading in our own lives, within our families, at work, or in our communities? Deborah's courage is inspiring because she didn't hesitate to make tough decisions. In a world where many shy away from responsibility, Deborah stood out as a leader willing to take risks. What is courage, after all? It's not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it. Consider the areas of your life where fear has been holding you back. What would change if you chose to act with the same confidence as Deborah? Faith played a central role in every decision Deborah made. She trusted God not only to guide her but also to guarantee the victory. This trust serves as a powerful reminder that, even when our abilities are limited, God is limitless. Perhaps you're facing a challenge today that seems impossible. Deborah teaches us that the answer doesn't lie in what we can do, but in what God can do through us. The question is, are you willing to trust His plan, even without knowing all the details? Deborah's leadership also highlights the importance of empowering others. She inspired Barak to overcome his doubts and enabled Jael to act at the right moment. This kind of leadership is rare but essential. Imagine how our communities, churches, and families would thrive if everyone adopted this approach. What can you do today to encourage someone around you? It might be as simple as offering words of affirmation, or as significant as mentoring someone in a skill or project. Another fascinating aspect of Deborah's story is how she united a fragmented people. In times of division, her leadership brought cohesion and purpose. Isn't this a relevant lesson for today? We live in an era marked by polarization, where uniting people feels more challenging than ever. Deborah challenges us to be agents of reconciliation, working to build bridges instead of walls. How can you apply this in your life? Perhaps it's by starting difficult conversations with empathy or showing a willingness to listen more than speak. Deborah's story also reminds us that God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. None of the central figures in this account were perfect or qualified by human standards. Deborah, Barak, and Jael demonstrate that God values willingness over skills. What does this mean for you? Perhaps it's time to stop waiting until you feel ready and start acting with what you already have. Finally, the most enduring lesson: faithfulness to God always brings rewards, even if they're not immediate. Deborah's victory brought 40 years of peace to Israel, a time of rest that resulted from obedience and courage. But the story leaves us with a reflection. How are we building a legacy of faith and leadership for future generations? Are we investing in what truly matters? And now that you've heard the incredible story of Deborah, pause and reflect. What has this narrative stirred within you? Isn't it time to face your own challenges with the same courage and determination? Deborah showed us that faith can be the greatest resource in times of difficulty, and that leadership is much more about service than status. But here's a big question. How can you apply these lessons in your life today? Perhaps you're facing a personal battle, at work, at home,